But what I'm saying is that when you put someone on an exclusively meat diet, they get better. So your study that says
Well, compared to garbage, maybe. Compared to garbage, maybe.
no, no.
No, no,
You're
no.
assuming that only people improving are the ones that are coming from a processed food diet. That is not the case. Thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are coming from a plant-based diet that are seeing massive improvements in their health.
And
That's not the
we're
thing
seeing
I'm
harm
talking
as well.
about.
We're seeing a lot of harm as well.
Insulin resistance goes down, and their leptin goes down, and their
But
CRP
see, these
goes
are just
down,
unfair.
and
I can
all
say
of
the
their other
same thing about a
biomarkers.
vegan diet.
The reason I did the video "Plants Are Trying to Kill You," and the reason I called it that was A, to call attention.
Yeah, it's provocative.
It's a funny
Provocative.
anecdote of when I was in, well, but it's also just a funny anecdote from when I was in college, and it's something that resonated with me. I've said before, I don't think that plants have something out against us and they want to get us. It's just that they are living organisms and they have to defend themselves, and they want to defend themselves, and they will defend themselves, and that we can eat plants. But being told that you can indiscriminately just eat a lot of plants, I think that's dangerous, and that's why I made the point with the WHO study, or paper, or
Page.
article, but so many others, that these things do exist. And if you don't pay attention to them, you can run into problems. And I've got a number of different studies to illustrate that. One of your critiques with Simon was that I ignored the fact that the WHO said, well, with a well-balanced, well-established diet, that you don't really see these things in dangerous numbers. But it goes on to say, if you don't do that, if these things get out of balance, you can go to the hospital or die. And so, I wasn't ignoring that. I was pointing out that these things exist, and you can't just ignore them. You can't just say, well, I'm sure it'll be fine. If I buy it at the grocery store, it's okay. Because it's not necessarily. And like I said earlier, there are traditional methods of cooking and preparing these foods that detoxify them, which again illustrates the point that we're not designed to eat them, because we don't have the inherent capacity to detoxify them and extract their nutrients. But if people are unaware of that, let's take the case of kidney beans. I have a number of different studies I can pull up on this, showing that in different areas, dozens or hundreds of people over a certain period of time, when they didn't cook or prepare red kidney beans properly, like in the UK, they were hospitalized. They had severe issues. There was a case or a time in Japan where they had there was like some recipe on television or something like that on how to cook some like white beans or something like that. It was incorrect, and about 1,000 people went to the hospital because they didn't prepare these things properly. It's not to say that you can't have a plant-based diet or include plants in your diet and be healthy relatively. It's that if you just indiscriminately just say, can't possibly hurt us in these numbers, and so I'll just eat whatever plants I want, I think that you're rolling the dice there, and I think that you can end up creating harm, and that you can hurt yourself.
What we ultimately need to look at are outcomes. So what actually happens when you pit vegans against meat eaters and you equate their protein intake? So there was a study done in Brazil in it was published in 2021. This is Hevia Lorraine is the author. The senior author was Hamilton Rochelle, and published in the journal SportsMed. And they found that when both groups are eating 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, and they're performing resistance training, you get the same results at the end of the day, same muscle and strength gains. So there are clearly issues with using those measures of digestibility, or really any measure of digestibility if it was something else, because the outcomes are the same. What I care about is, do you get the same result? There was also a more recent study. This one was looking at mycoprotein in particular. So this is, actually I guess I could share my screen for this. I should have done that. So looking at mycoprotein specifically, this is just from a presentation I've given before. Looking at mycoprotein specifically, so these are in certain like plant-based meat alternative products, primarily in the UK and US, and they had them eat either most of their protein from the mycoprotein or most of their protein from animal protein sources, upping it to above that 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. And again, they got the same result at the end of resistance training 5 times a week for 10 weeks. And these were people with a history of training too. They weren't untrained individuals in this particular study. So whether or not there's differences on certain measures as far as digestibility or whatever, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you're eating enough protein and matching intake.
So I've taken out a number of these clips from various studies and various sources to illustrate different sorts of points of plant toxicity in the foods that we are eating.
Can you provide the specific studies as well, just versus the clips? It's hard to see where that's from.
Yeah, so they're all out of these two. So this is the white kidney bean incident that I was discussing. So it was a TV program in 2006 where they're introducing a new diet and a staple food, and they found that viewers that tried to follow this, that 1,000 of them were actually poisoned, had acute intestinal symptoms, and 100 people were hospitalized. And they attribute that to the lectins in the white kidney beans were suspected to be the cause of the trouble. This is another, it's from a clip from another one that talks about the various different areas around the world where you have these poisonings, acute poisonings, 13 children that were hospitalized in Czech Republic from eating runner beans and French beans, and in Switzerland they had a number of these different plants that were the poisons from these plants were found to cause severe poisoning during that period of time. And it goes on. It mentions the Japanese study in China, 124 health incidents affecting 7,526 individuals related to fresh kidney beans were reported in a 9-year span. And Denmark goes on to discuss similar sorts of issues. So there are different, this is USDA.gov. And so looking at the International Journal of Poisonous Plant Research, and this is going into animal husbandry and the different sorts of plants that are harmful, so poisonous plant research. So that's just illustrating that in the field of toxicology and botany and animal husbandry, that this is actually a well-known phenomenon, and just indiscriminately eating plants can lead to trouble. And so again, it's not that you can never eat plants, it's just that you need to know what you're doing, and you can't just indiscriminately do it and just say, well, all plants should be fine in the levels that we're eating it, because what levels are we eating it? Some people are eating it in doses that are not acceptable. A good example of that is oxalates. I know that you've spoken about oxalates before, but there are some pieces of information that suggest that as much as or as little as 5,000 grams of oxalates can be extremely detrimental to health. There's more often 10,000 to 15,000 milligrams.
What do you mean by extremely detrimental, just so I'm clear?
Oh, death. It caused death. So there's case studies where people died.
In like dietary doses?
Yeah.
Like typical dietary doses?
At that 5,000 milligrams. I mean, the thing is that you
can't
just
much is
indiscriminately do that.
Yeah.
So in 100 milligrams of spinach, there's anywhere from 300 to 1,200 milligrams of oxalates. So
yeah, I'm seeing 1/2 a cup of cooked or 1 cup raw, about 650 average. So I mean, you're talking about I don't think anyone's recommending that much spinach. That's an insane
but that's
amount.
my point. Is that you do need to be clear. You have to draw a line. I think we agree that this is that you can't just indiscriminately eat plants, right? And
you
so
can't do
there
that
is
for anything. You can't do that for meat either, or animal products either.
But I don't think there's anything directly toxic in meat.
Slow lories, blue crab frit, common quail, garter snake, American toad, Azaic toad, cane toad, Colorado river toad, common toad, Fowler's toad, poison and dart frog, Pacific newts.
And toxins,
of course, blister beetle.
And toxic skin and all that sort of stuff.
Well, there's things that you can't just indiscriminately eat animals either, right? And we understand that.
Look, you're right. And I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that you can eat any poisonous animal or toad or anything like that. Certainly not. But the meat that we buy in supermarkets, say, I don't know of any poisonous animal that's sold there. And
I can reply to that when you have the chance. So are you pulling something else up?
Yeah, so I'm pulling up. So this is the table of the different oxalate content in different plants. And so, rhubarb and spinach, obviously having high numbers of these sorts of things, but other things as well. And so, and that's per 100 grams.
That's a
And
lot.
sure, yeah,
Like you'd have to
yeah.
eat an
But
insane amount to run into any issues.
sorry,
Well, as far
not
as the
yeah,
issues that you've mentioned.
milligrams. Right, yeah. Well, look,
Like
it
that's
happens, and
well,
there
I mean,
are
look,
case reports of people
everything
going to the hospital or dying.
of oxalate poisoning from spinach, like
Yeah.
from well, look, if
Well,
they're
and sorrel,
consuming
that's another one. And rhubarb, yeah.
well, if they're
Or
consuming
sorry,
that
yeah.
amount, then clearly they need some education on that, and I would agree with that.
Yeah, but
Um,
okay, so
yeah.
that's my point, is that you do need to tell people, hey, it's safe to eat to this point. Right now, no one's doing that, and I haven't heard anybody do that. And that's the purpose
But
of
so
making the plants are trying to kill you thing, is to point out that these things have something in there. Not that you can never include them in your diet, but that you do need to be aware there is an upper limit there, and that you can be harmed if you exceed it.
So but then are you accepting that at, let's say someone's eating, a cup of spinach, they're having, some properly cooked beans and so on in a day, that can actually be a really healthy option based on the health outcome data we have, of course, right? That seems
Well,
like it's what you're
because
saying, right?
Well, I think no. I think it can be you can have it in a more safe way if it's under a certain threshold, and depending on where you go and you look at that, different sources say that you want to stay below 100 to 150 milligrams per day, and with
150 milligrams
under-
of sorry, what? 150 milligrams of what?
oxalates
Of oxalate? But you said
of
it was like
oxalate per day
5,000 plus or 50,000
is
plus or something.
the fatal dose.
Yeah.
Dose,
So,
yeah.
but do you have
Yeah, but
evidence
you
of
can get
harm at?
harm long
But,
before it's a fatal dose,
but do
right?
you have evidence of harm at that 150 milligrams a day?
Yeah, so there are, well, there's just a number of different sources, and that's their arbitrary line that they're saying 100 to 150, and that
Well,
after that, if you're doing that perpetually,
Well,
that
can you
bring
show that though?
about
Right. That's
issues.
my question. Is can you actually show that that's the case? Like, can you provide some evidence showing that actually leads to worse outcomes? Not just someone saying so, but like that actually leads to a worse outcome.
Well, there's studies looking at kidney stones and nephrotoxicity
And
above
yeah,
that level.
can you bring those up at that level, particularly with adequate calcium intake? Because I've seen it in cases where calcium intake
Yeah.
is in the gutter, but above, like we look at the nurse's health study, above about 500 milligrams of, or was it 5 or maybe 700 milligrams of calcium a day, oxalates were not associated with kidney stone risk.
Yeah, no, so I agree with you there,
Yeah.
that if you add in adequate calcium, that can temper that. But it is just to illustrate that these things can cause harm. There are also studies that illustrate that if you
Like, can you
supplement
can you just
with-
show that? But before we keep going, can you actually just show the studies? I've never seen something at that low of an intake suggesting that it causes stones or nephrotoxicity in humans.
Yeah, 1 second.
I also
Meanwhile,
think that
yeah, I was gonna say. Meanwhile, while you're looking it up, I can respond to some of the lectin stuff, perhaps, or whatever.
yeah, I was going to say, for the sake of time, why don't we do this? Why don't Dr. Chaffee, you pull those up,
Yeah.
and then Dr. Nagar, you respond,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely, and then we'll wrap it up after that.
Yeah, and Anthony, can you just unshare so I can share in the meantime while you're looking that up?
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So just talking about this idea of lectins and plant toxins and so on. Obviously, I listed off there are poisonous animals, and if you want to talk about the ones that we see in the grocery store, I'll get there in a second. But if we look at the heat processing of red kidney beans, which are typically very concentrated with hemagglutinin, which is one of the lectins that can be toxic, if you soak them and then boil them for as little as 15 minutes, the lectins are then undetectable. If you cook them at 80 degrees Celsius for longer, I mean that's way lower temperature and longer than you would typically do, you can also achieve that. Or if you look at pressure cooking for just 45 minutes, which again is very typical, you abolish lectin levels. Now, I've seen that study, 50 incidents in the UK between 76 and 89. So over 13 years, there were 50 suspected cases. None of them were confirmed. None of them led to death. or sorry, some of them were confirmed. Not all of them were confirmed, and none of them led to death. But if we look at things that can happen if you don't properly prepare meat, well, keeping in mind that with lectins it is an issue of not properly preparing them. If you don't properly prepare meat, if people aren't informed of cooking the internal temperature of chicken, for example, up to a certain point, it can lead to salmonella. And in fact, if we estimate so we look at the total rate of salmonella cases in the US annually, it's 1.35 million infections, 26,500 hospitalizations, and 420 deaths per year. Remember, 50 suspected cases in the UK over 13 years of lectin poisoning. Far more cases of salmonella. And if we look at specifically what would be attributable to white meat, chicken and turkey, it's about 23% of that. So we're looking at over 300,000 infections and about 100 deaths because of that. If we look at the epidemiology of the E. coli outbreaks in the US over a couple decades, we see that the food vehicle for 41% of them was ground beef. And so again, if you don't prepare that properly, it can lead to illness, and this is something that you would buy in the grocery store. And it's not even just about not preparing them properly and then eating them. It could be the case that you didn't store it properly, you didn't clean the counter properly, you mixed it with other things in the sink, and it contaminates that and eventually infects you, and it can be very dangerous, it can be fatal. So and I agree that people need to cook legumes properly. I think we're both on the same page there. And when they do, we see that higher legume intake is associated with a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, a lower risk of all-cause mortality. And as I pointed out earlier, when we substitute meat specifically with legumes, we see improvements in coronary heart disease risk. These are, again, the outcomes I care about. So yes, we need to let people know how to cook legumes properly. Presumably a lot of people are doing it right based on this evidence, seeing that they have better long-term health outcomes. But in those odd cases where someone doesn't do it right, just like in those odd cases where someone, actually not so odd, presumably common cases where someone doesn't cook their chicken right or doesn't prepare their beef correctly, yeah, they need to be educated on it and make sure that they avoid the issues that can come along with it. So I don't see this as being much of an issue other than those minute cases where, yeah, a bit of education is warranted. And this is something I'd actually like to see some more kind of food education even in schools at a young age. I think it'd be really great. And I think we're starting to see a shift that way a little bit. Yeah, I just don't see it as a big concern. I mean, I'm of Indian background, and I can tell you that Indians know how to cook legumes. They've been doing it for a long time, but it doesn't mean that there aren't odd cases where people are under preparing them.
Yeah. So the point of that is that if you aren't aware, you can get into trouble. And so the denial of plant toxins, which doesn't sound like you are, it sounds like you are saying that you agree there are toxic elements in plants that you need to specifically prepare in order to temper that or to eradicate that. Is that right?
Yeah, so I would say that there are, but I don't think it's as difficult or needs to really be quote unquote specially prepared in a certain way. It seems to be pretty common knowledge outside of specific cases where you see these happen once in a while. But again, the same thing applies to meats as far as not preparing them properly.
Yeah, but understanding that though, it is passed down. Of course, it is. I was told by my mom that if a potato goes green, you can't eat it; it's bad. Or if it grows a root, you can't eat it; it's bad. But people who don't get told that or not told why that is, they can get hurt.
Yeah, but it seems like you agree also that it is the same with meat, right? It needs to be properly prepared as well. You need to handle it appropriately. You can't have it sitting out on the counters, etc. Right?
Well, certainly it's a food handling issue, and E. coli is a food handling issue. Obviously, that's an enteric bacteria. That's not inherent in the meat. That's coming from someone who didn't wash their hands.
But if you buy it in the grocery store, there is a good chance of it being there if you don't properly prepare the food, right? That's what we were talking about. You're saying if people are just going into the grocery store buying plants, they need to know how to properly prepare it. The same would go for meat, would it not?
The exact same risk comes from having produce that people are handling and meat that people are handling. The difference that meat,
but it's more common in meat,
packaged form,
and it's more common.
It's not actually.
Well, no. So 41% of the 41%.
Far more common.
I just presented data. I just presented data on E. coli infections. 41% of the outbreaks in the U.S. over a 20-year period, at least from '82 to 2002, were due to ground beef. alone, forget about other animal foods. For produce, it was like 22%, somewhere in that ballpark. So
What
about
about
half.
general food poisoning? What about overall food poisoning?
I mean, I'd like to see evidence if you have that produce is more common.
See, that's the thing, is that, this was the issue, the sticking point when we talked about having a debate earlier, was that you said, provide the one study you think that encapsulates your entire argument. It's like, I'm sorry, I have 25 years of background on this. There's not one study. So, I mean, that was a statistic that we were taught commonly in medical school.
Yeah.
The vast majority of food poisoning was from produce in America.
So in cases of produce, it is from contamination with fecal matter for sure, but it's not, based on the data that we're seeing, the data I just shared, that isn't the case. Ground beef is the primary food vector.
But you're talking
for E. coli.
specifically about
Yeah,
E. coli.
for E. coli. If we look at salmonella, white meat, chicken and poultry is the number one source. What else
But
is
overall
there?
food poisoning
So yeah,
is majority from plants.
but I would like to see evidence for that, right? If you can't provide evidence,
I can try and find that for you. That's just what is commonly
But just because
discussed in medical school and hospital.
something that's commonly said doesn't
that's
make
fair.
it right. Yeah.
But the thing is that what you're saying is completely counter to anything that I've ever been taught or anything I looked up. And specifically talking about salmonella and E. coli, fine. I don't have a problem with that. But that doesn't encapsulate all the known sources of food poisoning.
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, so the idea is that there's inherent risk to consuming plants that you pick up in the grocery store, right? I'm just pointing out that there are inherent risks to just consuming meat that is picked up in the grocery store if not properly handled and prepared, because you can't verify that they aren't contaminated with those things, and in fact it's very common, right? That's my point.
That's fine.
Yeah.
The difference being is that that's not something that's inherent in the meat. That's not a quality or a character of the meat itself.
But
that's something that's happened to it.
But that's something that people need to be aware of, right? That's
100%.
Yeah, exactly, right?
I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
And so, and that's totally fine. And as insofar as that's concerned, yes, definitely be aware of that. But I don't think it's fair to compare that to inherent toxins in plants, because those are inherent in the plant.
Here's why I think it is, because if you look at the rates of these toxicities to improperly prepared plants, any of those studies you presented on lectin poisoning, you can put it all together, and there are more infections from salmonella from chicken and turkey alone per year in the U.S. alone than over 13 years in the UK, or any of those other incidents combined, right? So that's the problem. You can't just say because it's inherent that legumes contain lectins, need to be prepared properly, that it's a bigger problem. Clearly it's not. Clearly just putting it out there that it is clearly a bigger issue, affects more people as far as consuming just poultry alone and just considering salmonella. Forget about everything else. That alone is a bigger problem than lectin poisoning from legumes, on a population population scale.
Okay, so since car accidents kill more people than guns, should we just ignore guns?
No, I'm not saying that. I already acknowledge that we should prepare legumes properly and educate people on how to prepare legumes properly. I'm saying that the same, and in fact a stronger critique can be made with regard to animal products and making sure people are preparing them correctly. I think that's a bigger issue. Both need to need education, and I agree. I think we agree on that. But I'm just saying
it's not one or the other.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not one or the other.
I would agree. Yeah, I would agree.
So, So just because there's another issue that may harm more people, that doesn't mean that this isn't harming people and we should just ignore it. And the entire purpose of that talk was just to bring this awareness to people. It was not to say that this is the number one killer in America. It was just to say this is a thing and you should be aware of it. That was it.
And so, but wasn't also, and this might have just been kind of undertone that I took from it, and you can correct me, but it seems like it was also to promote this idea of not eating plants, or at least shifting towards animal products, whereas when you look at the actual long-term health outcomes, switching those animal products, the meats, for plant protein sources is beneficial, as I've repeated, looking at the data we have on the topic. So if something has this much net benefit and there's a little bit of harm that can be mitigated with education, shouldn't we be aiming for that max benefit with some education to prevent these cases, versus looking at something that actually doesn't seem to provide that benefit for cardiovascular disease, at least in the data that we've looked at, cancers and so on, while also contributing to issues if not prepared properly, handled properly, stored properly? That's the issue that I would take with it.
Well, as Richard Feynman says, it doesn't matter how brilliant your theory is, and it doesn't matter how smart you are. If it doesn't agree with experiment, it's wrong. And we don't have experimental studies on this, but when we experiment as clinicians on the ground and we see hundreds and hundreds of patients have the exact opposite outcomes as predicted by these studies, you have to question whether or not these are right or wrong. And that's why I am questioning them. And that's why I'm going back to other sources of information and evidence to say, okay, what are we fundamentally and biologically? One study that, I'm sure you want to talk about as well to critique me on is the study looking at the physique and health of African tribes of Maasai and the Akikuyu. And this is something that people have tried to critique me on, but I don't think they've actually read the study. This looked at two populations, the Maasai in
Can you just pull it up while you talk about
Akikuyu.
it? Sorry, just to bring.
Sure.
Can you bring it up while you talk about it?
Yeah, so this is the studies and physique of two African tribes. So this looked at the Akikuyu and the Maasai who live next to each other.
That's not the
and
study.
they,
That's just the summary.
Yeah, I know, because this
Okay.
is, I want to show a part of it.
Okay.
This is the study. It's several hundred pages long.
Yeah.
Okay. So this looked at two African populations, the Maasai and the Akikuyu, who are genetically similar because they interbreed, but they also have very, very different nutritional components to their diet. So the Akikuyu are largely vegetarian. They eat some meat, but largely cereals and grains, and the women would eat more greens. And the Maasai would eat quite a lot of milk and meat and blood, especially the hunter class, the warrior class. And they found a lot of physical disparities between the two. So physical measurements of the full-grown Maasai male belonging to the carnivorous tribe to be on average 5 inches taller and 23 pounds heavier than the full-grown male Akikuyu, very similar to the differences in the what's seen pre and post agriculture. And as far as muscular strength, they're determined by diameter to be 50% stronger in the male Maasai versus Akikuyu. And in fact, the Akikuyu males were only slightly stronger than the female Akikuyu and were equivalent to the female Maasai. They also had marked differences such as greater incidence of bone deformities, dental caries, anemia, pulmonary conditions, tropical ulcers among the vegetarian tribes. They talk about the prevalence of intestinal stasis, so constipation. And they also mentioned rheumatoid arthritis, but if you actually look at the data when they look at the hospitals, rheumatism was small, but arthritis was higher, but they said that this was at a mixed hospital with a mixed population. They couldn't actually say that these were Maasai or if this was a mixed population of people from the city as well. So that's comparing a whole food plant-based diet, a whole food meat-based diet, and you're seeing quite significant differences in their development. There's also differences in their overall health. Now, this is saying good, fair, bad, very bad, all that sort of stuff. So, hard to say exactly what's going on there, but there are tables looking at the amounts of diseases that they were hospitalized with or treated as an outpatients for, and the Akikuyu tribe, males and females, were far more likely to be unwell and to seek medical attention or to be hospitalized than the Maasai. There was one gentleman, I don't know his name, but he said that I looked at this wrong, and it was in fact the Akikuyu females who had the best health, but that's not true. They actually, you can see, and these things, these are of the different sorts of boys, girls of Maasai and the Akikuyu. In fact, the 100% of the boys were very good, and the Maasai females were slightly less good, but the Akikuyu were much worse. Now the females of the Akikuyu tribe were better than the males of the Akikuyu tribe, but they weren't better than the Maasai, and they largely think that that's due to because they were eating more leafy greens and they had a better nutritional component from that, had better calcium as a result of that as well. And the the Akikuyu men did not have that. So you look at the different incidences of different sorts of issue, bone deformities, dental caries, dental defects, anemia, and enlarged tonsils. This is in the pediatric population under 17. You can see it's heavily skewed towards being worse in Akikuyu versus the Maasai, and the girls again being better than the boys in the Akikuyu, but the men being better than the girls in the Maasai, and the males in the Maasai would generally eat more meat and blood than the females as well. So, this can tell you that a number of different things. Again, it's not an experimental trial. It's not a something that we've controlled for every factor, but it did look at thousands of different people over a number of years, and they found very different outcomes than is predicted by these studies. And again, when you experiment with yourself or with patients and you put them on these different sorts of dietary interventions, they have radically different outcomes from their health than is predicted by these studies. So, Professor John Ioannidis from Stanford said that a lot of these epidemiological studies are pretty difficult to gain any real information from, because when you do an experiment, quite often they don't match up. And so, until we have more experimental data, it's going to be very difficult to say one way or the other, which is why I like to go to what we are really talking about, which is, what are we biologically designed to eat, and what is our biological design? What is best for us based on our biology? And I think that is meat.
I'm just bringing something up really quick, and then I will respond to that. So, going back to that study you just mentioned. Now, for starters, I think there's sort of a lack of relevance to really our discussion here, in that the diet that they were on was pretty well exclusively, it was 85% corn, millet, and sweet potatoes. It's not the diet I'm advocating for. Their calcium intake was in the gutter, again, not the sort of diet I'm advocating for. So it doesn't actually tell us about a more well-rounded plant-based diet that's, including, say, calcium-fortified foods that's higher in protein and fat, which is what I would ultimately suggest people follow. At the same time, you did mention that, or I should mention here that they write in the paper that at present stage we do not feel justified in attempting a detailed discussion of the results obtained or in attempting to draw definite conclusions therefrom. And that's largely because, as you said, this is not of the highest quality. It's they're looking at hospital records in certain areas. There were more hospitals in the area of the other tribe versus the Maasai tribe, and like you said, it's not clear how many people were attending the hospital, or how many Maasai specifically were attending the hospital available to them. It could go either way. Maybe RA, rheumatoid arthritis rates, were actually higher in the Maasai. We don't know. They also do mention that while I'll
just point out that they did actually go from tribe to tribe.
And, they did, and the rates were about the same. Yeah, and the rates were about the same as what they noted in the hospital. So even then, it suggests that it is probably
slight differences, but yeah.
But more it's not an earth-shattering difference, right? It was minor differences. Yeah. And they also say that although there has been a good deal of intermarriage between the two tribes, they were originally of different stock, and we have no information as to whether or to what extent the differences in stature and physique may be inherited. So we also don't know for sure. Again, I'm not advocating for this very low protein, low calcium diet anyway, but even so, we can't say for sure that it's not genetic because of the interbreeding. We don't know exactly to what extent that was. Now, what they didn't really touch on here was some of those outcomes that we've been discussing this entire time, things like cardiovascular disease. And so have you looked at data on cardiovascular disease in the Maasai?
So, cardiovascular disease at that time was really a non-entity.
Wait, so you're saying it didn't exist at that time?
No, I'm not saying it didn't
exist. Or
exist.
very rare?
Yeah, well, and potentially in that population, it wasn't that common either. In America, it started becoming one of the number one killers at that time. But 20 years before that was the very first autopsy that proved myocardial infarction.
Just so I'm clear, when you say that it was rare, obviously myocardial infarction, not recorded necessarily for that long, but do you mean they didn't develop signs of cardiovascular disease, atherosclerosis, Anything?
So, just go, well, I don't know about it at that time. I mean, certainly now they would. I mean, they've been more incorporated
Okay.
into Western society.
Yeah.
And before
Sorry.
1910 or 1907, there were no documented cases of myocardial infarction death in America. It was completely unheard of. In fact, that wasn't even believed that was a cause of death at that time.
Okay. So I'd like to just share a little bit here. Atherosclerosis has been characterized in the Maasai. So this is back from the 70s, looking at atherosclerotic plaque development on autopsies of Maasai warriors. And we see that with age, so we get into like 40s here and up to, sorry, what's happening? My browser said something weird. Anyways, I will just, whatever. It's on the Riverside app, some stuff popped up. But we see that atherosclerosis does develop into the 40s, 50s, 60s, and actually matches roughly the amount that we see in U.S. men ages 60 to 69. So it is present. It was present. This is half a century ago. If we look at
but that's half a century after this study was.
Yeah, and I'm not aware. Are you aware of actual detailed characterization of arteries on say?
So that was my point, is that all the different health outcomes that they looked at, that wasn't one that they considered, which suggests that it wasn't a major outcome.
Well, so it might not have been a cause of death if they weren't living all that long. There wasn't data on life expectancy in the paper you shared, but I just want to go through a few more things because, like Lauren said, we are strapped for time. We can look at 16th century Greenland Inuit mummies, and we see that in this sample, 500 or so years ago, there was evidence of atherosclerosis. Now they only looked at the 4 mummies that were available to them, and 3 of them had pretty extensive atherosclerosis. And if we look at life expectancy amongst the Inuit, even after considering child mortality, they live significantly less than other Canadians currently. If we look at Inuit population in Greenland, we see that with rapid westernization, as time has gone on, the risk of cardiovascular mortality has declined. And even if we compare to other Canadian populations, during a given time period, say in the 90s, we see that the Inuit population actually was worse off than other Canadians as far as cardiovascular disease. We have mummies going back 4,000 years where there was presence even in pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers that there was indeed atherosclerosis in their arteries. And we have some mummies from Lithuania on the right side here also suggesting so. I'm trying to speed through this. Please pause and check these out if anyone wants to read that. And so there are actually clearly documented cases of atherosclerosis by actually opening up the arteries of people who had died for various causes. I mean, a lot of them may have died very young, and so they wouldn't ultimately suffer from an MI, but it was there clearly up to 4,000 plus years ago in pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer populations. Now, the other thing that you had mentioned about epidemiology is that it doesn't translate to outcomes in when we actually do experiments, randomized controlled trials. And in fact, that's not true. So Schwingshackle and co. actually did an analysis looking at the concordance rates between meta-analyses of prospective cohorts and meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials. And looking at all these outcomes, alpha-linolenic acid and cardiovascular diseases, polyunsaturated fat overall and cardiovascular events, low sodium diets and all-cause cardiovascular mortality, cardiovascular disease, diet quality, etc., down the row. And we see that in 21 out of 23 of these cases, so about 91, 92% of cases, the prospective cohorts do actually align with the results fairly well from randomized controlled trials when we put them to the test. And like I cited right out the gate, we have the Leon Diet Heart Study as well, which specifically replaced animal foods with plant foods if you look at the statistically significant differences in dietary intake. And so, yeah, I think it's pretty clear that these populations do get atherosclerosis. The study that you cited from the 30s did not look at those long-term outcomes. The Akikuyu, I'm going to butcher the name, they don't eat a diet that I advocate for at all. I don't advocate for that sort of a very low protein, very low fat, very low calcium plant-based diet. So I don't even see it as being relevant to the discussion when I'm talking about these foods and long-term health. as I've demonstrated.
Look, the thing is though, is that you're talking about a whole food plant-based diet, an entire civilization who lived generationally on this, and the argument is that so what you're saying is that a carefully controlled, well-designed vegan diet is okay with supplementation.
It depends on what you mean by carefully controlled, well-designed. I don't think it takes that much effort. In fact, if we look at, like I said, population level data, these aren't people with, graduate educations who are all adopting this vegan diet. We see that even actually when adjusting for education, when adjusting for socioeconomic status, they still do better than the meat eaters, right? So it's not some special care that they have.
You're saying the Akikuyu don't count because they didn't do it right.
No.
But they're living generationally on this.
Well, yeah, I'm saying that, yeah, they aren't doing the iteration of the diet based on living in what is presumably an impoverished area. If we look at Maasai children, they have high rates of anemia too. Like, we don't need to point to these populations who struggle to meet their needs nutritionally regardless of diet when like, that's not what I'm talking about at all. I'm not talking about that diet, and it doesn't take all of this crazy amount of extra care when we're seeing in the population vegans tend to do really, really well long term as far as chronic disease rates, right? That's what matters. And clearly they're doing it okay.
Well, I mean, some are, but again, in practice, in experiment, when people are doing this, they are improving. I'm seeing people directly improved by this, by the thousands. And so, that doesn't meet up with the studies, but you know what? A lot of studies have been wrong many times for many reasons, and because they just aren't designed to be perfect. They just can't be, and they have implicit biases for a number of different reasons. And there are different sources like the University of Washington doing a review on hundreds of different cancer studies looking at red meat and processed meat, but in particular unprocessed meat, and they found that the studies were quite poor quality.
Sorry, which paper in particular?
So I think at this point, what we have to do is agree to disagree.
Well,
in that the reality is that what you guys are both saying is that we have a lot of studies that prove my point or prove others' points. And what we're both saying, all of us are saying, is that also some studies just are bad. And there's just a lot going on there. That's not to fault either one of you for your perspectives or your opinions on either.
Well, I would agree with that. Just, I mean, the same, but the thing is, the same can be applied to smoking. We can look at, there are studies that suggest it is associated with a lower risk of lung cancer, but what we do is we dive into the methods. Anthony himself, agreed that is the case, and we point out why one study is necessarily better than another. That's what I would do here, and I don't think that's been done on my side. And in fact, if I had, like, let's say I had a bunch of clients I was working with, obviously this isn't true, but I was having them smoke and they were losing weight, they were reducing their anxiety, they had some mental clarity, so to speak, would I be promoting that as a healthy diet? And I'm not, or a healthy thing to do. I'm not saying that that's equivalent. I'm just saying that these anecdotes, we're not following people for 50 years. You haven't been in practice that long, neither have I. What is ultimately being suggested here is that, oh yeah, these swaps in the context of a less healthy diet, you swap meat for plants is beneficial, but all of a sudden if you go to all meat, it's beneficial versus that swap slightly towards more plants. It doesn't make any sense. That you're talking about a curve that goes like this or something, or actually the other way.
But what that suggests is, again, experiment is what trumps all. If it doesn't agree with experiment, it's wrong. And so I haven't gone through that study you're referencing, so I don't know, the specific sort of, ins and outs of it. So I can't critique it at the moment. But what I can tell you is that if you are doing something and it gets the exact opposite results of what any study suggests, then that study is wrong. Or there's some sort of flaw in it.
If I put people on smoking, but if I told people to start smoking and they lost weight, they felt better, they had mental clarity, is that a good thing?
Yeah, but that's not what I'm saying.
No, I know that's not what you're saying. I'm saying that
rheumatoid arthritis and MS.
Okay, so here, this is good.
So I'm gonna
wait, but this is really good. Parkinson's disease, ulcerative colitis, smoking actually helps in those cases. So if I put someone on, someone started smoking,
it's literally everything. It's literally everything.
You
and
can't
I have
make that
patients
claim.
whose CAC score goes down after a year of being on a carnivore diet. And I have patients whose insulin resistance goes down, and their leptin goes down, and their CRP goes
these are just
down.
I can say the same thing about a
biomarkers
vegan diet. I can
improve.
say the exact same thing about a vegan diet.
But what I'm saying is that when you put someone on an exclusively meat diet, they get better. So your study that says
Well, compared to garbage, maybe. Compared to garbage, maybe.
No. I'm talking about people that were doing whole food, plant-based diet and attempting to be healthy, and they were not.
So what if I? No.
You're assuming that only people improving are the ones that are coming from a processed food diet. That is not the case. There is thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are coming from a plant-based diet, a whole food diet, or a whole food omnivorous diet that are seeing massive improvements in their health. It is not just a processed food diet going to a carnivore diet. That does exist.
And
that's not.
We're seeing harm as well. We're seeing a lot of harm as well. Carnivore cringe, like I said, anyone look that up on Instagram. I've had people message me. I've had people message me saying, "Hey, I tried carnivore, was terrible. I went, vegan, better than I've ever been." We can play the anecdote game back and forth. What matters is when we actually look at
when you fix it. Like you said, the Akikuyu don't count. That they didn't do your style of vegan diet. That's fine. I have a lot of people who message me as well and saying they are having problems, and I work with them and I troubleshoot for them, and then they improve and they get better. I have yet to see someone come to me with problems and not be able to figure it out with them. Not a single time.
And we can play the anecdote game back and forth. It doesn't tell us anything. These aren't verified.
Not an anecdote game.
No, but
this
it
is real life. This is experiment.
And anecdotes, they are anecdotes. They are actually by definition anecdotes.
Yeah. So, the plural of anecdote is data. And when you are dealing with patients on the ground, and this is what you're seeing, and it's going against recommendations.
Okay, so
but hypothetically, if I told people to start smoking,
what I think we should do is probably wrap it here, and then we can have a follow-up from this that y'all can follow up on.
Okay.
Individually. I mean, this could go on forever and ever, right? Which I would love it to, but we can't. I think if that is cool with you guys, why don't we just agree to disagree there on some of those points? But I think also, I do really think that the commonality is that we know processed food sucks. We know that. We know that a lot of data out there is flawed. We know that there's a lot of data out there that's good. We also know that what everybody's doing right now doesn't work, right? So the thing that both of you guys are doing is trying to help people and trying to help people be better because you found something that worked for you, right? And so why would you not share that with other people? And you also found that it works for however many other people out there. That's why you're talking about it, right? So I think ultimately at the end of the day, I think there's a lot to agree on there. And I do look forward to the next follow-up conversation that we can have with this. What I'm going to do is put your guys' socials below, okay, so that everybody can follow you. I believe you guys send those to me, whatever you think they would be. But give me like a couple sentence ending from both of you guys if anything else is okay, closing out. Why don't you go, Dr. Nagros first?
Yeah. So, at the end of the day, like I've kind of come back to a few times throughout, is that what I care about are those long-term health outcomes, and consistently when we look at higher consumption of plant foods, whether that's at the expense of a so-called standard American diet or whether that's at the expense of meat particularly, we see benefits. We consistently see improvements in cardiovascular risk, cancer risk, type 2 diabetes risk. We've touched on a lot of ideas throughout this. I think that's ultimately the thing that it comes back to, at least for me, right? Because that's what I care about as a healthcare provider. But also, I don't think there was any critiques. Now, I know Anthony mentioned that he needs to brush up on these studies in order to critique them, and I'm happy to come back for a part 2 so we can have that chat. But thus far, as far as substitution analyses, there have been no critiques as far as the long-term RCT in the form of the Leon Diet Heart, suggesting that replacing animal foods with plant foods, leading to about a 70% reduction in mortality. There has been no critique. And as far as anecdotes, like, look, we can tell people to smoke and they improve Parkinson's disease, ulcerative colitis risk. It doesn't mean that it's good long-term. These patients haven't been followed long-term to see if they've developed diseases that take 40, 50, 60 years to occur. And that's what I'm worried about, is that people are going to adopt these sorts of dietary practices and run into issues way down the line, like I've shown, even in those ancestral populations. Inuit mummies from 500 years ago, mummies from Egypt 4,000 years ago, mummies from Lithuania 400 years ago. We see that they do develop atherosclerosis, and it can be quite extensive. So even if we look at those cultures presumably following those dietary practices, still not a good thing long term.
So I would just say that the reason I don't really pay too much heed to these studies is because they aren't great, and so we don't. So studies on my side or your side or whatever, they're not great, and so they're not proving anybody one way or the other. And we have a number of conflicting points of evidence. So that's why I think you need to go to our biological nature, what we are designed to eat. I don't think that you've made a cogent argument on why that's okay to not eat what we're designed to eat, and why it's not okay for basically any other animal on Earth to do that. Why that's particular to us, that we can eat something that didn't exist 50 years ago, let alone 50,000 years ago. And so the idea that we can just dismiss people that are improving dramatically, I don't think is right either. We're saying that yes, you reduce your diabetes, which first of all significantly reduces your risk of developing heart disease, eliminated metabolic disease, which also significantly reduces your risk of heart disease and other sorts of illnesses, and then that doesn't matter because long term maybe something will happen. Well, maybe, but it's really going against the objective evidence, which is that they're improving. You have people improving on Alzheimer's, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's. If someone's having bloody diarrhea 30 times a day, they need help. And this is something that helps, and this is something that's in the literature showing that it helps. People with MS, people die from MS, and so saying that, well, maybe 30, 40, 50 years down the road, someone can have problems. Well, they're not dead from MS. So that's good. So I'm glad they got 40 years to die of something else. You see people in nursing homes, coming out of nursing homes. There's a gentleman in Scottsdale, Arizona, who is now with hundreds of people, rehabbed terminal Alzheimer's patients and gotten them home again by doing these sorts of dietary interventions. So maybe they die of something 10 years down the road, but you know what? They're not dying of dementia and Alzheimer's right now. So that's an improvement. As to mummies having atherosclerosis, there's a number of different things that cause atherosclerosis. Smoking, stress is a major one. Probably the only experimental trial that's ever shown reduction or reversal of atherosclerotic plaques were stress relief, people meditating for 40 minutes a day and improving their outcomes with atherosclerosis. So, people living in 1600s Greenland could be very stressed. It's a harsh environment. You're in Greenland, and it's during the mini ice age. And so that's not a very fun condition to be in. It could be very stressful. There are also mummies looking at in Egypt during post-agricultural revolution, when they were largely eating grains, and they showed atherosclerosis and so forth. And so this isn't just typical of people that eat meat or exclusive to those people that eat meat. Atherosclerosis
I
is
just want
not
to say I never
exclusive.
said that. I just want to clarify that's not my position, that it's exclusive.
Okay.
What did you say? Sorry? What did
Yeah,
you
yeah,
say?
no, I just wanted to clarify, just so that it's not taken as that's my position. Right? It's not my position that the only cause is meat consumption, just to clarify.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sure. And so, that's the thing, it is interesting these people have atherosclerosis, but there can be different factors. It's not just, one thing or the other. Looking at the heart disease rates and poor outcomes in the Greenland population versus, Canadians or other populations, there are plenty in that same time period of Canadian Inuits that show the exact opposite.
That was
And
Canadian to
before
Canadian, FYI. It was Canadian
Okay,
to
so
Canadian.
we're
Okay,
rocking.
No, but I'm just
That's what I'm
pointing
saying.
out
So-
because it's mischaracterizing what I said. I'm
No,
just
that's-
clarifying.
I know,
So,
but
I
I think
apologize.
that's more
Yeah.
just
So-
Yeah.
All
more
I'm
just the
saying
point
is
of this is a
that
closing
this
general
is
statement.
So this is again, just again and again and again, there's an abundance of conflicting evidence, which is why I think that you have to go to first principles. You have to go to the bedrock of the situation and look at biologically what we are and what we are designed to eat. I don't think it holds that what we are designed biologically to eat is going to be harmful to us long term. I just don't think that holds true.
Okay, awesome. Well, I appreciate both you guys. I really do. I really appreciate you guys very much. Thank you for doing this.